Your grandparents helped pay for a war they never fought. Most people do not realise this, but countries kept sending payments on Second World War debt well into the 2000s. Decades after the bombs stopped falling, taxpayers were still quietly footing the bill. Now we are repeating the same pattern on a much bigger scale. Only this time it is not just one war, it is decades of bailouts, stimulus, cheap money, and political promises that were all funded with the same tool: debt. And when governments run up that tab, they do not send the bill to the people who made the decisions. They send it forward in time, to you, to your kids, to your future paychecks. Before we get into the numbers, a quick disclaimer. Nothing in this video is personal financial advice. It is for education and entertainment only. Markets are risky. Your situation is unique, and you should always do your own research or speak with a professional before making any financial decisions. Because what we are facing now is not just a normal cycle. It is a bigger crisis building on the horizon, one that could shape the next 20 or 30 years of your life, even if you never watch a single news broadcast again. So why talk about a bigger crisis now? And why say it will last for decades? Because the numbers that usually only matter to economists and central bankers have quietly crossed lines that history has already warned us about. Global debt, public plus private together, is now around $250 trillion, roughly more than twice and a bit the size of the entire world economy for a whole year. That is not just a big number. That is like every household on Earth trying to live two expensive lifestyles on one paycheck. And in the United States, the national debt has just pushed past $38 trillion. Interest payments alone are now close to $1 trillion a year. Almost $1 out of every 5 tax dollars going just to service old promises instead of building anything new. Think about that for a second. Before your government can spend a cent on schools, roads, healthcare, or defence, it has to make the minimum payment on a maxed out national credit card. That is the shape of a crisis that does not end with a single crash. It drags on for decades. But this is not the first time a country has done this to itself. During the Second World War, Britain was fighting for survival against the Axis powers. Tanks, planes, ships, food, everything cost money that Britain did not have. So the government did what governments always do when the house is on fire. It borrowed from the future. Britain took huge loans from the United States and Canada, on top of borrowing heavily from its own citizens. By the late 1940s, Britain's debt was more than twice the size of its yearly economy. Imagine owing 2 full years of your salary, with interest, before you even pay rent or buy groceries. That is what a debt load of more than 200% of national income feels like. Here is the part nobody tells you in school. That war ended in 1945. The bills did not. Those loans were stretched out over decades. Payments started in the 1950s and kept going. Year after year, through different governments, different prime ministers, different crises. British taxpayers kept sending a quiet slice of their taxes overseas. The final payment on that Second World War debt was made in late December 2006. Let that sink in. A war that ended before your grandparents were even adults was still showing up on tax bills into the 21st century. Whole generations who never saw a blackout, never heard an air raid siren, still paid for the bombs and bullets through higher taxes and slower growth. That is what a long, slow debt crisis looks like. Not chaos every day, just a constant drag. Rationing in the early post-war years, cramped housing, high taxes, a government that had less room to manoeuvre every time something went wrong. Britain eventually grew out of that hole with a baby boom, new industries, and a lot of painful reforms. They were lucky. Most countries that pile up that much debt do not walk away so cleanly. Look at Argentina in the early 2000s. Their debt swelled to well over their yearly economic output. Investors lost faith. Capital fled. The government defaulted. Overnight, millions of people saw their savings destroyed, unemployment surged, and the middle class was thrown backward by a decade or more. Ordinary families paid the price in empty fridges, lost homes, and cancelled futures. That is the pattern. Debt feels harmless while it's being spent. The pain comes years later, quietly, and it always lands on people who never voted for the original promises. Now bring this back to today. Economists at the World Bank have warned that when a country's government debt sits for a long time above roughly 3/4 of its yearly economy, growth starts to slow. It is like dragging a heavy trailer behind a small car. You can still move, but the engine is straining and every hill hurts. We are not talking about 70% anymore. The International Monetary Fund says global public debt is on track to head back toward levels we only saw around the Second World War. They expect government debt worldwide to be close to the size of the entire global economy by the end of this decade, and under more severe scenarios it could rise well beyond that. Meanwhile, global debt of all kinds, government plus corporations plus households, is already more than twice world income. In plain language, the whole world has done a Britain in wartime move, but in peacetime for lifestyle, politics and quick fixes. That is why this crisis is different. This is not just about one bubble in housing or one reckless year on Wall Street. This is about a system that has been running on tomorrow's money for decades and has now hit a wall called higher interest rates and slower growth. And while governments have been piling up their own IOUs, households have been doing the same thing. In the United States, total household debt has climbed to roughly $18.5 trillion. That is several trillion more than before the pandemic. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards, personal loans and of course student debt. You can feel that in your own life. The car that used to be a 5-year loan is now a 7-year chain around your ankle. The credit card that was for emergencies quietly became the thing you swipe for groceries. The student loan feels less like an investment and more like rent on your past. You are not alone in that feeling. Researchers at the New York Federal Reserve have pointed out that younger borrowers are now showing more signs of stress, more late payments, more accounts slipping into serious delinquency. For someone in their 20s, that is not just a number. That is the difference between being able to move apartments or being rejected by every landlord in town. So you have 3 layers sitting on top of each other. Governments loaded with debt, corporations with huge borrowing, households stretched thin. At the same time, the bill for ageing populations, healthcare and pensions is rising faster than tax revenue. In the United States, interest on the national debt is already close to 1/5 of all federal revenue, roughly the size of an entire giant government department just paid out to bondholders. Every year that share grows, the government has 3 choices, and none of them are fun for you. Cut programs, raise taxes, or try to inflate the debt away by letting prices rise faster than they admit. This is the machine's favourite trick. On television you hear, "We have everything under control. Inflation is easing. The system is strong." Behind the scenes, central banks and governments are quietly accepting permanently higher debt levels, higher prices, and negative real returns on savings as the path of least resistance. They will not call it a default. But if your wages lag behind real living costs for 10 or 20 years, and your savings earn less than the true inflation rate, that is a slow-motion confiscation of your future. History has already shown us where this path leads. Our anchor story was Britain's war debt. But zoom out and you see the same rhyme in other decades. In the 1970s, many rich countries faced a toxic mix of high inflation, high unemployment, and high government debt. Central banks had to slam on the brakes with brutal interest rate hikes. It took more than a decade of pain to reset the system. Now combine that kind of inflation fight with today's much bigger debt mountain and much older populations, and you begin to see why the next crisis is not a single moment. It is a long era. Here is where the smart money quietly disagrees with the happy headlines. Right now, one of the most famous investors on earth, Warren Buffett, is sitting on a record mountain of cash inside his company. Berkshire Hathaway has built up hundreds of billions of dollars in cash and short-term government bills. That is not the behaviour of someone who thinks everything is cheap and safe. That is what you do when you believe storms are coming, but you do not know exactly which tree will fall first. The machine is talking like everything is fine, but some of its sharpest players are acting like firefighters waiting for a call. Because it is not a question of if, only when. That line is not meant to scare you. It is meant to shift your mindset from victim to planner. If you know the next decade is likely to be defined by high debt, higher taxes, repeated inflation scares, and occasional financial accidents, you can stop asking, will there be a crisis? And start asking, how do I position myself so I am not crushed by it? Think of it like preparing for hurricane season. You do not wait until the roof is ripping off to buy plywood and batteries. You prepare while the sky is still blue, when the shelves are still full. So what does preparation look like in a world where the crisis is not one storm, but a whole stormy climate? Part 1 is what I would call storm prep. Storm prep is the boring, unsexy stuff that nobody posts on social media. It is building a small buffer of cash instead of letting lifestyle chase your paycheck. Even a few weeks of expenses sitting in a boring account changes your relationship with fear. That is 1 month where your card declining is not a guaranteed disaster. It is dealing with the most painful, high-interest anchors first. That one credit card with the brutal rate. The personal loan you took to cover 3 other mistakes. Every dollar of interest you stop bleeding, there is a dollar you can eventually redirect toward buying assets instead of renting your past. Storm prep is also mental. It means understanding that higher taxes and tighter government budgets are not a moral failure on your part. They are the delayed consequences of choices made decades ago. That understanding keeps you from panicking or falling for every populist promise when cuts and tax hikes arrive. You do not have to agree with it to plan for it. Part 2 is what you do when the real waves hit. Because in a highly leveraged world, crises do not arrive gently. They show up as bank scares, housing corrections, market sell-offs, or shocking headlines about some country defaulting. When that happens, the crowd response is always the same. Sell everything. Run to cash. Assume it is the end. The prepared response is different. A prepared person walks into that kind of panic with 3 things already on paper. First, a short list of assets they actually understand and are willing to own for a decade, even if prices fall further after they buy. Not a list of hot tips from social media. A list built when they were calm. Second, a plan to scale in slowly rather than going all in at once. For example, deciding ahead of time that if markets fall by a certain amount from previous peaks, they will deploy a small slice of their dry powder, and if they fall further, they will add another small slice. That turns chaos into a series of steps instead of one terrifying leap. Third, a set of rules for mental hygiene. That might mean limiting how often you check prices. It might mean muting certain news sources when the fear machine goes into overdrive. It might mean having one trusted friend or partner you talk to before doing anything drastic. When you see debt and crisis as a decade-long background, not a breaking news event, you stop trying to time the exact moment of impact. Instead, you position yourself to survive and slowly benefit from the clearance sales that repeated panics create. And here is the most important psychological shift. You are not going to fix global debt. You are not going to fix government deficits. You're not going to convince the machine to suddenly become responsible. But you can refuse to be the easy victim. You can choose to be the person who understands that every stimulus check, every bailout, every temporary program often becomes part of a larger bill that will be collected through slower growth, higher taxes, or sneakier inflation over the rest of your working life. And once you understand that, you can build your own little balance sheet in the opposite direction. Less dependence on debt, more ownership of real assets over time, more margin between your income and your obligations. The coming decades might be shaped by a bigger crisis, but that does not mean your entire life has to be won. It means the game board is tilted. The machine designed it that way. It needs you confused, scared, and always one paycheck behind, so you keep swiping, keep borrowing, keep accepting whatever story makes you feel less crazy. You are not crazy. The system is. And the more you understand how past debts echo forward for decades, from war loans in the 1940s to stimulus binges in the 2020s, the more you can look at the next headline and say, I see the pattern. I know which part of this I can control. So as you listen to the next promise that everything is under control, remember Britain making its final wartime payment in 2006. Remember that someone born long after the bombs stopped falling still paid the bill. Now imagine kids who are toddlers today paying through their taxes and their weaker growth for the choices being made right now. The horizon is not just next quarter, it is the next 20 years. The question is not whether there will be a crisis. The question is who will be prepared and who will be surprised. If you have made it this far, you are already ahead of most people, because you are willing to look past the headlines and think in decades, not days. Stay curious, Stay calm and keep building your own plan in a world that has clearly lost its mind about debt. And a final reminder, I am not a financial advisor, and this is not financial advice. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. You should always do your own research and make your own decisions.